Thank you very much, Marina. And also from my side, welcome everybody for the second open webinar on the construction industry. So the previous one, the recording is found on our website. If you have missed it, it was all about prefabrication, the future of prefab. So for today, we have a different topic, and the topic is digitalization in the construction industry. And as you might have seen our invite, the focus will be on building information modeling. More on that later. So for today, I would like to start with a short introduction of whom we are. And then as an additional bonus, which was not in the invite, want to share with you our forecasts for 2024-2025 when it comes to the construction market, the future building volumes predictions we have. And then, of course, we will focus on digitalization, specifically on BIM. So first, shortly about USP. Who are we? Why are we doing these webinars? Well, first and foremost, we're a market specialized agency operating internationally, conducting market research for the construction, installation, and home improvement market segments. We provide both tailor-made, dedicated market research services, so one-on-one market research, and we also have a portfolio of off-the-shelf reports, which we call multi-client researches. We are active both B2B, B2C. We do qualitative, quantitative market research and various different market research types. For us, it is most important that it is within our specialty area: construction, installation, home improvement, and real estate. That's for us the most important, because here we can really add value. Now, as for today, much of the information you will be seeing is coming from our off-the-shelf report portfolio. The reports we do are listed here, and I think one of the key things to note is that other than other reports that are out there, all of these reports are based on quantitative market research. What do I mean with that? Actual telephone interviews by actual people in native language. For example, for the European Architectural Barometer, we do 3,400 successful telephone interviews with architects in the 8 countries listed here. And every quarter, a report is published focusing on a certain topic, like, for example, building information modeling, but also prefab, sustainability, decision-making, and so on. As we are going to talk about digitalization, I've been pulling information from both the European Architectural Barometer and the European Contractors Monitor, but I also took some information from the Installation Monitor. Installation is obviously also part of the construction scope. Could also merit its own webinar on digitalization, but for now, just to have an interesting comparison throughout the business value chain, I included them as much as possible. So last but not least, whom are we working for? This is just a selection of customers whom we are working for. So you can see that we are working throughout the business value chain, supplying manufacturers and wholesalers alike with key insights and advice. Now, with that out of the way, let's start with the bonus content, because I think it's quite relevant and there's a lot of things happening in the market. So I think looking at the general market situation till, let's say, 2022 or towards the end of 2022, the market was really booming. The construction industry at large was booming. New build was increasing, but specifically also the renovation side of the market was increasing. Prices were good, and overall we were in a very good market situation. But somewhere around the end of 2022 and basically from 2023 onwards, we see that the market has a much tougher time. And the high growth rate is no longer visible in the market, or at least not in all countries. And it's clear that the construction industry has after a booming period now, has a cool down or even a period of decreases. As I said, end of 2022, beginning of 2023, there was a strong turnaround from the positive years before. I think these 3 images together are quite telling of the story. First of all, the construction production volume. If we start to look at the percentual changes in comparisons to the previous years, this is for EU 27, you can clearly see that we are starting to drop below the 0 line, meaning that there is a decrease in construction production volume. And this started to happen around 2022. Now, if we look at the construction cost index, we see that the cost from 2020 onwards really increased significantly. So the cost of construction increased significantly. And then finally, construction confidence indicators. Yeah, you see that after a peak 2022, towards the end of 2022, the construction confidence indicator dropped negative again, which it was for a very long period. Now, why these 3 points? I just want to emphasize, we see lower construction production volumes, we see higher construction cost, and we see lower construction confidence. And these are, let's say, the key indicators of a decline we see end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And to further elaborate on the reasons behind this decline in the construction market, high interest rate, meaning higher finance cost, which is especially hurting new build, which I'll show you a little bit more in a second. But we also saw the material prices increase, thus higher material cost. We also, of course, all know about the uncertainty in the economy, but also the uncertainty about the new political developments. We, besides higher interest rates and higher material prices, also are faced with a labor shortage, which is increasing the labor cost in construction. Especially the last, let's say, 12 months, we see that the boom in sustainability and improvements of sustainability in the construction industry dissipated, especially the installation market. I was just reading some news that in Germany, the amount of heat pumps sold first half year 2024 compared to first half year 2023 show a 50% decrease in sales. But it's not just heat pumps. Overall, the appetite for investing in sustainability started to flatten out after a peak. Speaking of peaks, we also need to consider that we are comparing, and I'm going to show you 2023, we are comparing with peak periods. That's always important to bear in mind. So decreasing market since the end of 2022, but that's not the full story. Because if we look at 2023, it wasn't the worst of years yet. So it wasn't great because these are not high growth numbers, especially not for the Netherlands, Belgium, France. The UK was mildly positive, and only really in Spain and Italy was there some healthy growth. 2% norm I always consider as healthy growth. But you already saw, let's say, the situation changing in Germany and Poland. And mostly throughout 2023, the outlook we had for building volumes was not great. And this is mostly because of the negative building permit developments we see in many countries, but also negative experiences of architects regarding their order book and turnover developments. Now, if I had to show you this picture, let's say the beginning of 2023, it would have looked more negative. But looking backwards, Q4 2023 looked much better and was much better than the first 3 quarters. And much more volume was produced in Q4 2023, which ended up making this picture a little bit more positive. But if we look at, for example, Germany, where we saw a quite strong decline, this is a telling picture because the strongest decline was for the blue line, new construction. That's where you see the market decreasing from 2022, actually already in 2021 for Germany, but 2022 specifically, and then towards 2023. For Germany, that decline was compensated by, let's say, a good growth of the renovation market segment. But okay, this is still looking backwards, and I think we're not here to look backwards. We want to look forwards. What do we expect for the future? Now, what I just shown you, these predictions are part of our future building volumes prediction model, which can be found in the European Architectural Barometer. Basically, we predict 2 years in advance based on sentiment of architects, building permits, GDP data, everything together in a model. And this shows you the blue line were our predictions. The orange line is when we look back, when the year was complete, and we look back at our prediction, and we compare it with the actual output that Eurostat published. You can see that our model is quite well and reliable in predicting future building volumes, just as a little bit of background. So 2024, the outlooks are not great. And that can be immediately shown. Minus 3.8 in the UK, even France, 0.2 decrease. In the Netherlands, a minus of 1%, and in Germany, a minus of 2.5. Given all of the negative news, I would say the outlooks are not looking great, but they are also not dramatically bad, except for the UK and Germany. And the bad thing, of course, is that those are two of the bigger markets in Europe, so they will have a strong impact. But still, 2024, you could consider is relatively stable still in many countries. For example, Spain, Italy. I would consider France, the Netherlands, and Belgium also in this stable scenario. But we do see a bigger decrease in the UK and in Germany again. Now, this is mostly due to the negative development of building permits we mentioned already earlier. So 2024, not looking great. Decreases in a couple of countries, but it's also not, let's say, a very big meltdown of the market, except for, again, the UK and for Germany. Now, what about 2025? Will we still in 2025 be in this situation of decreasing markets? Or is there a little bit of brightness ahead of us? Well, for 2025, we expect the construction market to bounce back in most countries, except for the UK. Please bear in mind these growth percentages are 2025 compared to 2024. And 2024 was compared to 2023. So our prognosis for 2025 is an increase in construction volume in all countries, except for the UK. In some countries like Spain, it will actually be quite a strong growth, but also in Germany, there will be quite a strong rebound. Obviously, you are comparing with Germany, where we just saw 2 years of decline, so that needs to be put in perspective. And if we again zoom in on Germany, what's clear to see is that the renovation market is continuously growing, and you saw the new construction continuously decreasing. But our prediction is for 2025, there will be a turning point, a positive turning point from new build, which is in the end what's needed to increase the growth. Now, why do we say that the markets will increase to grow? Well, the key drivers are, one, we have a big problem, especially in Northern Europe, with affordable housing. There's a shortage. We have postponed new build for almost 1.5 to 2 years now. There is a point, a tipping point, where just houses need to be built, and that needs to start relatively soon. We also see that the strong renovation market is keeping, let's say, the general growth afloat. And because we are expecting decreases in interest rates, we think that this will fuel more new build. And of course, the mobilization of consumers to switch between houses. So on the one hand, the strong renovation market is stabilizing, let's say, the volumes, and the growth needs to come from a bounce back for new builds. And we expect this due to the decreasing interest rate, but also we expect for 2025 to see an uptick again in sustainability improvements. And last but not least, the building material costs are lower, which slightly lowers the building costs overall. So the key drivers for the growth. So in hopefully approximately 15 minutes, I was able to explain to you what we expect in terms of market growth in 2024, 2025. Are there any questions on that, or if you have any questions on how we make these predictions, feel free to put them in the chat in the Q&A, and I'll answer them right after the presentation. Now for the topic at hand, digitalization and building information modeling. Now, I already explained that we will focus more on the BIM side of this topic. Why, could you say? Because there are many other elements to be considered. You could say, well, 3D printing is a form of digitalization, robotics, obviously, automation, smart wearables on the construction side, Internet of Things, AR, VR, laser scanning, all true, and all part of digitalization. However, we will have a dedicated report coming out. It will actually be the next report in the European Architectural Barometer on the future of construction, where all these elements are measured. What I can already tell you is that many of these elements are still, let's say, so early in their development that there's not really a lot of new or interesting things to tell about. It's still, let's say, in a very early phase of development. Maybe not for the Internet of Things, but for the other ones, this is actually the case. Plus, so we will be doing a dedicated topic, let's say, on future of construction later this year. Two, I think that many things can be tied to or require focus on BIM. So that's why I want to also focus on BIM. Many of these new developments require a form of digital modeling of the building, and which is typically BIM. Furthermore, because BIM has been a, let's say, long-term trend, we can actually look at the BIM adoption rate and measure the overall speed of the digitalization process. In other words, how quickly can we expect these other things to be adopted by looking at something that's been in the market for much longer, building information modeling. Now, let's start with the BIM adoption throughout various target groups, but let's start with the architects. Now, why would I like to start with the architects? We know from the past that they were the early adopters, the early majority, and I would dare to say now we're closing in on the late majority. Now, architects, of course, are at the forefront of the cycle, of the building cycle. They are the most of all target groups, maybe engineers as well, but mostly involved in the design. So it's also most logical that we see the highest percentage of BIM users amongst architects. So this is the European picture. So in 2009, when we started, we saw that 10% of all European architects were BIM users. And now in 2023, it is 45%. So a very strong growth and gradual at first, but then quicker and quicker of BIM adoption amongst architects. Now, interestingly, between 2021 and 2023, we see that the growth was minimal, 44% BIM users, 45% BIM users in 2023. But there is actually quite a simple explanation for that. So the reason why this growth, let's say, is flat in this period, it correlates with the decreasing new build volumes we see in this period in most countries. And why is that important? Well, building information modeling, BIM modeling, mostly new build related. If new build decreases, the need to work in BIM decreases, and thus typically the adoption rate decreases or flattens out. We also noted this, for example, in our previous webinar on the future of prefab. Prefabrication in construction shows a increased adoption rate throughout the years, but during, let's say, prior to the Corona period until now, we see it also flatten out. Again, we can tie that directly to decreasing new build volumes because both BIM and prefab, there's a correlation between the two, but there's also a correlation between the two and new build volumes. Now, what about future expectations? So will we see a continuous slowing down of the trend? No, not if we ask the architects. If we ask the architects about the expectations to use BIM in the upcoming years, we see that towards 2025, the prognosis is 56% of all European architects are BIM users, reaching almost 60% in 2027. There will be a ceiling at some point because not all architects are involved in new build and thus will not have the trigger or push to start using BIM. So we will never reach, of course, 100%, not even 80%, but I think this will gradually grow to 70%-ish, and then that will be the cutoff point. Now, before we continue, I need to point out two important things, and this is not just for architects, but for all target groups. Two important things need to be noted when we talk about BIM. First of all, company size matters. Secondly, geography matters strongly. I will be mostly showing you European figures in our reports on these topics on BIM with various reports from the architects, contractors, installers. You will also see all of the country information, country details, and much more information than I'm presenting right now. But I mostly will stick to a European level. But just to show you the key differences, for example, in the Netherlands, I think the late majority has already been reached, and the potential for further growth is minimal because 3/4 of all Dutch architects are BIM users. And I think this last quarter will not be really unlocked because, smaller architects mostly focus on renovation or interior jobs will not likely be doing BIM. But if we compare it to the country where we see the lowest percentage of BIM users, and you can clearly see that the gap is enormous. In Italy, about a third of all architects use BIM compared to 3/4 of all Dutch architects use BIM. So big differences between geographies. What's also, as I mentioned, important is the company size. And you could even argue that there's even a bigger difference here. For example, if we look at architects with 2 to 4 employees, full-time employees, 33% are BIM users. If we look at the group 10 till 19, this increases to 71%. This is on a European level. And if we look finally at the group of 40 employees and upwards, 95% BIM users. So almost all architectural firms that have more than 40 employees use BIM. So 2 very important things to consider. Now, what about other stakeholders? We already know now architects across Europe, across company sizes, 45% are BIM users. Now, if we look at the contractors, general builders, and for general builders, we're looking at companies of 5 employees and upwards. We excluded 5 and less. 12% are BIM users. If we look at HVAC installers, this is 9%. And finally, electrical installers, 11%. So basically what we can note, if we go deeper down the business value chain, from the architects to the contractors to the HVAC installers and electrical installers, the percentage of the target group that uses BIM drops. Again, I need to note, for example, in the Netherlands, the share of electrical installers doing BIM jobs is already above 30%. And then if you even consider company size and you look at the bigger companies, the image is much more similar to architects. But generally speaking, you could say the deeper you go down into the business value chain, the less often BIM is used if you look at the representative sample of the target groups. Now, this is partly logical. On the one hand, installation companies are typically subcontracted more, for example. They are not necessarily actively involved in the design of the installation. This can be done by an engineering company, and then they just get the installation job. And with contractors, of course, a large group is also mostly, let's say, renovation focused. So no BIM there. And on the other hand, also, even if there's a big project, they tend not always have to work in BIM. So that's the reason why I think the deeper you go into the business value chain, the less it's used. Plus, architects have a much longer time working with BIM and are much more familiar with it. So that's the main reasoning. Now, what's interesting, that even though the 3 target groups are different, they do show very similar developments when it comes to BIM usage. So again, the bigger the company, the higher the percentage of BIM users. The adoption rate for all 3 target groups is the highest in the Netherlands for BIM, and it's the lowest in Germany or Italy, depending on the target group. And what's also interesting to see is that we can also tie it to turnover. The higher the turnover of a company towards new build is, the higher the likeliness that they are BIM users, further closing the loop. Now, we can also look at the key difference, and the key difference, I think, is the speed of adoption. The deeper down the business chain you go, the slower we see the adoption curve go. So you already saw the adoption curve go from architects, from single digits to double digits quite quickly. Let's see at contractors. We only have 2 measurements there, 2019, 2022, but it was a growth from 11% BIM users to 12% BIM users. HVAC installers, we have slightly more measurements. 7% in 2018, 7% in 2020, 9% 2022, 9% 2024. Electrical installers show a slightly bigger growth rate, 5% to 7 to 10 to 11. Now, if I were to leave you with this, I would not have painted the right and full picture. Yes, of course, I showed you that company size matters, activity matter, and geography matter, but there's another thing which is important. Among the BIM users, so among target groups, the BIM users in the target groups, we do see the turnover of BIM projects as part of the total turnover they get increasing, but also the number of projects done in BIM. Let me show you an example for architects. So the turnover from BIM projects, and obviously we ask this to BIM users only, not to confuse things, is 52%, meaning if an architect does BIM projects, it reflects approximately 52% of their total turnover. So you could say almost half or slightly more than half of their turnover is coming from projects where BIM is used. So that's already quite significant. And this percentage is also slowly but steadily increasing from 47% in 2019, 2021, it was close to 50%, and now we're at 52%. So the companies that are doing projects in BIM see their turnover from these projects increasing in the total turnover mix. We also asked for architects, unfortunately not for the other target groups, but we asked them what percentage of projects is BIM being used. So again, for the BIM users. So it grew from 21% to 25%. So there's a growth there. So even though the percentage of BIM users did not grow that spectacular, we do see the turnover from BIM projects and the amount of BIM projects amongst BIM users increasing. Contractors show the same image. 41% in 2019 increased to 52% of turnover coming from BIM projects. And also for installers, if they are using BIM, and it's a slight group, small group, but if they are using BIM, it really is representing a large share of their turnover. And bear in mind, these are typically the bigger companies. So this, let's say 50% approximately of turnover is the turnover coming from, let's say, the bigger companies within these target groups. So that's important to note. Now, another thing that's interesting is looking at software usage. If we look at software usage, and I look at the top 3 here, it doesn't differ that much between the target groups. There are some slight differences. Architects mention number 1, Autodesk Revit, number 2, Graphisoft Archicad, and Vectorworks number 3. If we look at electrical installers, Autodesk again, number 1 position. The number 2 position is my favorite one, Other. And then number 3, Graphisoft Archicad. And HVAC installers, again, Autodesk Revit, Allplan number 2, Graphisoft number 3. Now, there are, let's say, at least for the number 1 position, not big differences between the different target groups. We didn't ask this towards contractors, but I would assume that it would be quite a similar picture. What is quite interesting to see, and we have that in our full reports, of course, is that the differences per country are bigger than the differences between the stakeholders. So some software is being used in some countries much more often than others. The differences are much bigger than if you just look at the differences between these target groups. So that's an interesting thing to note. Now, looking at what percentage is using BIM in their projects, what type of software do they use, the turnover is all interesting, but of course it's also quite important to understand what do they actually do within a BIM model. And I'm not sure if I can actually call it like that, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you look at what they actually do within BIM, so what BIM features are they actually using, I would consider the features they use as quite traditional still. So if we look at architects and we ask them the question, which of the following features do you use? We see that the vast majority uses generation of 2D drawings from the 3D model. Then we have a big drop-off already, but still a considerable percentage says clash detection, clash control, and determining quantities and exchange of structural product information. Afterwards, it starts to drop down significantly with, for example, 5D, coupling, linkage with the cost, only 17% of European architects mention this. There are some differences in the country. Surprisingly, I cannot make the statement that the more, let's say, BIM users a country has, for example, in the Netherlands, the more advanced capabilities or features they are using. There's not a direct correlation there. But there are differences in between countries, where in some countries the clash control is more important, and in other countries you see 5D a little bit more often. But generally speaking, this is a good representation of Europe. So I would consider the BIM features being used as still quite traditional. Now, looking at contractors, one thing immediately pops up, and that is that contractors are using more, or let's say more different features of BIM, because the percentages are significantly higher. We see, let's say, more or less the same top three. But for example, if you look at 4D and 5D, the percentages are significantly higher. 5D 17% architects, 5D 21%. So they are higher, but also 4D is higher. So even though I would still consider contractors to use more the traditional features, like generation of 2D drawings, like determined quantities, they also use, let's say, more features, and thus they also use more advanced features, which is not strange because, of course, they get the model and they have to do a little bit more with it than just, let's say, the design side. So quite interesting to see the differences there. Now, the installers, I would say, are a little bit more also, again, in line with the architects, using slightly less different features, and it's mostly generate work with 2D drawings from the 3D model, make 3D visualizations, and then collision detection, so basically clash control. Now, we can also look at something else, which I always like to do, is the LOD levels that are being used. So the question here for architects was, to what level of detail or level of development, however you want to call it, do you specify in your BIM models? Mind you, this was for the report end of last year, came out beginning of this year, so it's really fresh. We can clearly see two things. One, LOD level 300, that's the level of detail most often specified. If you add to that, let's say, the 5 and 7% of 100, 200, you could even conclude that the majority is up to level LOD 300. But what is quite interesting is that 41% of the architects say they don't know enough about the LOD levels. So we could clearly conclude here that architects really do not have a very high knowledge level yet about LOD levels if they cannot answer these questions. Now, if we switch, for example, to installers, they seem to have a much higher level of knowledge of LOD and use also significantly more LOD levels. The don't know percentage here is only 19%. But also here, LOD level 300 is used the most, 21%, followed by LOD level 350. But interestingly, LOD level 400, LOD level 500, if you see these percentages, 14%, 9%, they are significantly higher than what we see with the architects. So a conclusion we can draw is that installers know more about the level of detail, if they're BIM users, and they tend to work with higher levels of detail than architects. Now, we have looked at LOD levels, usage. It's also interesting to see what type of fonts do the target groups actually prefer. Well, it is actually quite similar, but there are some differences. Let's take a look at architects. So if we ask the architects, what do you use? Native file data, open file data, or do you use it equally? Then the majority, slight majority, says equally, 33%. Second highest native file, but it's actually quite close together. So almost a 30-30-30 split. Now with contractors, approximately the same amount, says equally, but there's a big difference because they tend to prefer open file data much more over native file data compared to the architects. And this is also the same when we look at installers. So there's a clear difference between architects and, let's say, the stakeholders deeper down the business value chain, contractors, installers, that they tend to prefer open file data more over native file data compared to the architects. So that's also quite interesting. There are also considerations to be made that there are quite significant country differences. And in the full report, we also ask them where do they find the information, or where do they look for the information, and is it an open source library, these kind of things. There, the differences per country, again, are quite strong. But this is the overall European picture. Now, as we are closing towards our 45 minutes, some final insights. I would like to switch back purely to the architect, because, of course, they are most advanced, let's say. So we asked the question, which other parties do you already cooperate with using BIM processes in your projects? Might not have come as a surprise, but the number 1 and 2 are engineering companies. Engineering companies for construction, engineering companies for installations. So those are the number 1 and 2 companies they tend to work with the most when it comes to BIM. And number 3, main contractors, 31%. But then it drops off quite significantly. But still, electrical installation companies, HVAC, 16-15%, are still scoring relatively high. But these are the main stakeholders in the BIM process. We also ask them, well, what kind of information do you then share with these parties? And then again, you can see that, let's say, it's quite traditional. 3D drawings, complete model of the project building, actually, of course, is a little bit more advanced, but then 2D drawings, number 3, and partial models, number 4. Other things like product information, design to completion, product planning, in terms of cost and timing, score significantly lower. Now, the last 2 things I want to share with you before going towards the conclusions. What do architects actually specify? What type of building parts do they specify most often? So in the traditional, let's say, ones, walls, floors, ceilings, and building structure. So those are the building parts that are specified the most. Those are actually typically also the building parts where architects are most involved. And these are also the building parts, for example, where you see prefab usage the most. Well, then we also have detailed bathroom products and detailed kitchen products actually scoring quite high. So for these 2, let's say, product groups, it's becoming more and more important as well. Then which performances of building products are specified? So there we see basically thermal, fire, and acoustic making up the number 1, 2, and 3. So thermal performance, fire performance, acoustic performance. And then aesthetic is a close number 4 with acoustical. But if you look at other things, durability, sustainability, that scores significantly lower. Now, what can we take away, or what do I take away from this, and what would I like to share with you? Well, let's start with the elephant in the room. BIM adoption rates have been flattening out somewhat. There is a clear correlation with the lower new build levels, as I already shown. The deeper down the value chain you get, the usage and the adoption rate of BIM declines. In terms of features used, BIM features used, and LOD level specified, there is still a lot of untapped potential. So the BIM, the ones who are using BIM are not using BIM to its fullest potential yet. But turnover from BIM projects is increasing if they do projects in BIM, and the number of BIM projects are also increasing amongst the BIM users, and this is throughout all of the target groups. Our prognosis is that future expectations for BIM usage will start to grow again. Why? We expect new build to start to grow again. Then automatically the demand for, let's say, more projects in BIM will increase. We also see that if new build increases, higher prefab usage is a consequence, especially with labor shortage. And that being one of the only solutions for it, for labor shortage, prefab. Well, if you want to do prefab right, you need BIM. So more new builds, more pressure to build more in prefab due to labor shortage. Two very important drivers for BIM growth in the upcoming years. And last but not least, it's also regulated more and more and more. But that's mostly for non-residential. We actually see BIM usage growing the quickest in residential. And of course, sustainability. The more rules, the more regulations, the more product information needs to be, let's say, showing sustainability or sustainability calculations. Let's say, more likely it will be adopted in a BIM model, and thus BIM adoption will also increase. So these are, in my opinion, the three core reasons why BIM usage will continue to grow. And last but not least, company size, geography have a strong impact on the share of BIM users. Now, when I did the last presentation on digitalization, I give them quite often, but one that sticks in my mind 2 years ago, I got the question, well, but you know, should you start to work with BIM when you're a flooring manufacturer? And I got some other examples. And already at that point, I said, yes, because in my opinion, BIM is a license to operate. And even though BIM usage, for example, amongst installers and contractors is lower, we need to consider that the bigger companies doing most of the new build, they do use BIM. And they use BIM on, let's say, quite a detailed level of detail. And they use it for quite a broad range of products. So if you are not BIM ready, then there is a likeliness that the installers will go for another option. That's why I tend to say building information modeling is a license to operate. But I also say this because we do expect BIM usage to continue to increase slowly and steadily over time due to, as I said, for example, prefab, and that more and more sophisticated features, for example, we saw robotics, will depend on a working BIM model. So without building information modeling, it will be very hard for the other, let's say, developments to take place. So it's also a little bit of a tandem effect.